The Bible tells us about Jesus as a child. It tells us about Jesus at 30, beginning his ministry. But what happened in between? 18 years. 18 years of silence. The most influential figure in human history simply disappears from the record, and no one is supposed to ask where he went or what he learned. Until now. The being that appeared to me didn't just fill in the gaps. It showed me where Jesus traveled during those missing years, who he studied with, what he was taught, and why the church has fought so hard to keep this information buried for 2,000 years. What I learned will challenge everything you think you know about Christ, because Jesus didn't spend those years as a carpenter in Nazareth. He spent them on a journey that took him across the ancient world, learning secrets that would later become his miracles, studying with masters whose teachings the church declared heretical, preparing for a mission that was far bigger than any gospel has ever revealed. The missing years aren't missing by accident. They were erased, deliberately, because what Jesus learned during that time threatened the power structures that would later claim to speak in his name. I warn you now, this revelation will disturb you, not because it diminishes Jesus, because it expands him beyond the limits religion has placed on him. And it reveals that the abilities he demonstrated were not unique gifts from God, but skills he learned, skills that any human can develop. If you're ready to discover what really happened during the lost years of Christ, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Because what James Thornton witnessed will not just rewrite biblical history, it will show you why those 18 years had to be hidden. Now let me tell you how it all began. James Thornton was sitting in the ruins of his academic career when the light appeared outside his window. At 59, he had spent 35 years as a professor of New Testament studies at a prestigious seminary in North Carolina. He had published 12 books on the historical Jesus. He had trained hundreds of ministers who now led congregations across the country. He had been, by every measure, a success. And then he had asked the wrong question. It started with a paper, a simple academic paper exploring the silence in the Gospels between Jesus at 12 years old in the temple and Jesus at 30, beginning his ministry. 18 years unaccounted for. 18 years that the biblical authors seemed determined to skip over. James had proposed, carefully, academically, that this gap deserved investigation, that ancient texts outside the canon, texts from India and Tibet and Egypt, contained references to a young Jewish teacher who had traveled east during exactly this period, that the silence might not be accidental, but intentional. The backlash was immediate and devastating. His colleagues called him a heretic. His department chair suggested he take a leave of absence. Parents of students complained to the administration. Within 6 months, James Thornton found himself offered early retirement or termination. He chose retirement. It was the only choice that let him keep his pension. Now he lived alone in a small house in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the house his parents had left him, the house where he had retreated to lick his wounds and wonder if his entire life had been a waste. His wife Ellen had tried to be supportive, but 32 years of marriage couldn't survive his transformation from respected scholar to academic pariah. She stayed in Charlotte, in the house they had shared, while James disappeared into the mountains with his books and his questions. "You've become obsessed," she had said during their last real conversation. "This isn't scholarship anymore. It's a crusade, and I can't watch you destroy yourself over 18 years. That probably don't matter." But they did matter. James knew it in his bones. The missing years were the key to understanding who Jesus really was, what he actually taught, why his message had been so powerful that it changed the world, and why so much effort had been spent making sure no one ever investigated them. James had continued his research in isolation. He corresponded with scholars who shared his interests, most of them working outside mainstream academia. He collected ancient texts that hinted at Jesus' travels, Tibetan manuscripts describing a Saint Isa who had come from the West, Egyptian records of a Jewish healer who had studied in Alexandria, Indian traditions about a teacher who had learned at the feet of Buddhist masters. The evidence was fragmented, circumstantial, and nothing that would satisfy peer review. But the pattern was undeniable. Something had happened during those 18 years, something significant enough to erase. The night the light appeared, James had been drinking whiskey and rereading the Gospel of Luke, the only gospel that mentioned Jesus as a 12-year-old, amazing the teachers in the temple with his wisdom, and then nothing. Silence until the baptism in the Jordan 18 years later. "Where did you go?" James muttered at the page as he had muttered 1,000 times before. "What did you learn? Who taught you?" That's when he noticed the light. It came from the tree line at the edge of his property. A soft, blue-white glow that pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat made of light. James set down his whiskey. He walked to the window. The glow was still there, partially obscured by the pines, but definitely present, definitely real. His first thought was a practical one, a downed power line, some kind of electrical phenomenon. The mountains had strange weather sometimes, but the light wasn't flickering like electricity. It was pulsing, breathing, almost alive. James pulled on his boots and jacket. He grabbed the flashlight he kept by the door, and he walked out into the cold mountain night, toward the light that shouldn't exist. The forest was silent. No wind, no animal sounds, just the crunch of his boots on the frost-hardened ground and the gentle pulse of that impossible glow drawing him forward. He reached the tree line and pushed through the low branches. The light was brighter here, casting blue-white shadows that moved with each pulse. And then he saw its source. A figure stood in a small clearing, humanoid but not human, tall and slender, with skin that seemed to be the source of the light itself, glowing from within like a lantern made of flesh. The face was smooth, almost featureless except for eyes that were vast and dark and ancient. James stopped breathing. His flashlight fell from his fingers. His scientific mind screamed that this was impossible, a hallucination, a breakdown finally arriving after years of stress and isolation. But another part of him, the part that had spent 35 years studying mysteries, felt something different. Recognition, as if he had been waiting for this his entire life. "Do not be afraid, James Thornton." The voice appeared inside his head, calm and resonant. "I have come because of your questions, the questions you have asked for 35 years, the questions that cost you everything." James tried to speak. His voice wouldn't come. He swallowed hard and tried again. "What are you?" "I am a keeper of records, a witness to history, and I have come to show you what you have been seeking, the truth about the missing years, the truth about where Jesus went and what he learned, the truth that your church has buried for 2,000 years. James felt his heart pounding against his ribs. Everything he had sacrificed, his career, his marriage, his reputation, it had all been for this question, this one question that no one was supposed to ask. Why me? Why now? Because you were willing to lose everything for the truth. The being's eyes pulsed with that inner light. That willingness has opened a door, and I have walked through it to meet you. James stood in the cold clearing, facing an impossible being, trembling with something that wasn't quite fear. "Show me," he whispered. "Show me where he went." The being extended one luminous hand, and James Thornton, disgraced scholar and seeker of forbidden knowledge, reached out and took it. The moment their hands touched, the clearing dissolved. James felt himself pulled through something that wasn't quite space. Colors he had no names for streamed past him. Sounds that weren't sounds vibrated through his bones. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. He was standing in a vast chamber, the walls curved upward and inward, meeting at a point so high it disappeared into soft light. The surfaces were covered with symbols that shifted and rearranged themselves as he watched, as if the room itself was alive and thinking. "Where am I?" James turned slowly, trying to orient himself. "What is this place?" "You are in a repository." The being stood beside him, its luminous form even more striking in this strange light, a place where records are kept, histories that your world has forgotten, truths that have been deliberately hidden. Records of what? Of everything significant that has occurred on your planet, every teacher, every revelation, every attempt to awaken humanity, and every effort to suppress that awakening. James felt his breath catch. "You have records of Jesus?" "We have records of the one you call Jesus, yes. We observed his entire life, not just the fragments your Gospels preserve. Everything, including the 18 years your scriptures refused to discuss." James's legs felt weak. He had spent 35 years searching for scraps of evidence about those years, fragments in obscure texts, hints in forbidden gospels. And now he was being told that complete records existed. Why? He asked. Why would you record the life of a Jewish teacher 2,000 years ago? Because he was not merely a teacher. The being's eyes pulsed with inner light. He was a pivot point in human consciousness, a being who demonstrated possibilities that your species had forgotten. What he achieved during his ministry was remarkable, but it was built on what he learned during the years you call missing. James moved closer to the walls, watching the symbols shift and flow. Can you show me? Can you show me what happened during those years? That is why I brought you here. But first, you must understand the context. You must understand why this information was hidden, and why revealing it now matters. The symbols on the wall began to coalesce into images. James watched as scenes formed in the air before him. Your species was not meant to worship Jesus. The being's voice resonated through the chamber. He came to demonstrate what humans could become, to show that the abilities he possessed were not divine gifts reserved for a chosen one, but capacities that exist within every human being. The images showed Jesus as a young man, not the serene figure of religious art, but someone intense, searching, hungry for understanding. He was extraordinary from childhood. The incident in the temple at age 12 was not an isolated moment. It was a sign of a consciousness that was already awakening. But awakening to what? That was the question that drove him. That sent him on the journey your church has tried so hard to erase. Where did he go? James whispered. Everywhere that wisdom was being taught. The images shifted, showing a young Jesus leaving Nazareth, traveling, walking roads that led east and south. The being's voice continued. He knew that what he was seeking could not be found in the synagogues of Galilee. The teachings there were incomplete, fragments of a larger truth that had been preserved elsewhere. James watched the young Jesus journey across ancient landscapes, through deserts, over mountains, along trade routes that connected the ancient world. He went first to Egypt, to Alexandria, to the mystery schools that preserved knowledge from civilizations long forgotten. There, he learned the first layers of what would become his teaching, the understanding that consciousness is primary, that matter is secondary, that what humans call miracles are simply the application of laws that most have forgotten. The images showed Jesus in a great library, studying scrolls, debating with teachers in white robes, learning disciplines of mind and energy that no gospel had ever mentioned. The Egyptian mysteries, James breathed. I theorized this, but I never had proof. You have proof now. The being moved beside him, but Egypt was only the beginning. The images shifted again. James saw Jesus traveling further east, through Persia, into India. He spent years in the east, in monasteries in the Himalayas, in ashrams along the Ganges. He learned meditation techniques that allowed him to access states of consciousness your modern world doesn't believe exist. He studied healing methods that worked with energy rather than medicine. He practiced disciplines that gave him control over his own body that seemed supernatural to those who hadn't been trained. James watched Jesus sitting in lotus position among saffron-robed monks, walking mountain paths with teachers who moved with impossible grace, engaging in practices that looked like prayer but were clearly something more. The Tibetan texts were right, James said quietly. The stories about Saint Isa, they were true. They were incomplete, but their core was accurate. Jesus spent years learning from masters who had preserved ancient knowledge that had been driven underground in the West but flourished in the East. The images shifted once more. Jesus, older now, returning westward. His face had changed. There was a depth in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a stillness, a power. He returned at 30 years old. The being's voice carried weight, not because 30 was a significant number, because his training was complete. He had learned everything he needed to learn. He had become what he needed to become, and he was ready to demonstrate to his own people what a fully awakened human could do. James stared at the images, tears streaming down his face. Everything he had theorized, everything he had been mocked for suggesting, it was true. Why was this hidden? He demanded. Why did the church bury this? Because if people knew that Jesus' abilities came from training rather than unique divine gift, They would try to learn what he learned. They would seek the same awakening. They would become like him. The being's eyes met his, and a population of awakened humans cannot be controlled. James felt the weight of those words settle into his chest. The religion built in his name was designed to create followers, not equals, to create worshippers, not practitioners. The missing years were erased because they contained the one thing the church could never allow people to know. What? That you can do what he did, that every human can, that the kingdom he spoke of is not a reward after death, but a state of consciousness available here and now to anyone willing to walk the path he walked. James stood in the chamber of records, surrounded by the true history of Jesus of Nazareth, and felt his entire understanding of Christianity crack and reform. "Show me everything," he said. "Show me what he learned, what he practiced, what he became." The being's luminous form seemed to brighten. "I will show you more than that, James Thornton. I will show you what he wanted his followers to know. The teachings behind the teachings, the practices that were stripped away when his message was turned into a religion." The walls of the chamber began to glow brighter. The symbols moved faster, and James Thornton, disgraced scholar, received the education he had been seeking his entire life. The chamber transformed around him. James found himself standing in ancient Alexandria, not observing from a distance, present, as if he had been transported through time itself. This is memory made manifest. The being's voice accompanied him. You will experience what he experienced, learn what he learned, understand what he understood. The city was magnificent. Marble buildings gleamed in Mediterranean sunlight. Scholars in robes walked through colonnaded streets, debating philosophy and mathematics. And at the center of it all, the great library, the repository of human knowledge that would later be burned and lost. James watched as a young Jesus, perhaps 15 years old, entered the library complex. He was accompanied by an older man in white robes who moved with the quiet authority of a master, his first teacher. The being's voice provided context, a member of the Therapeutae, a Jewish mystical sect that had preserved knowledge going back to Egypt's earliest dynasties. They recognized the potential in the boy from Nazareth and agreed to train him. James followed as the young Jesus was led into chambers beneath the library, hidden rooms that the public never saw, walls covered with hieroglyphics that seemed to pulse with inner meaning. Here he learned the first principle. The being continued. That consciousness precedes matter. That what humans perceive as solid reality is actually condensed thought. That form follows mind, not the other way around. James watched as Jesus sat in meditation, surrounded by teachers who guided him through practices of breath and visualization. Days passed in moments, weeks compressed into minutes. James saw the young man's awareness expand, his perception shift, his understanding of reality fundamentally transform. The miracles he would later perform were not violations of natural law. They were applications of deeper law. The being's voice carried weight. When he turned water into wine, he was not performing magic. He was manipulating the energetic substrate that underlies all matter. This is what he learned in Egypt, the malleability of physical reality when consciousness is properly trained. The scene shifted. James now stood in a temple complex he didn't recognize. The architecture was different. The air was warmer, humid. India, the being explained. He traveled there at 17, following trade routes that connected the ancient world. He had heard rumors of masters who had achieved states of consciousness that even the Egyptians only theorized about. James watched Jesus walk through villages along a great river, the Ganges. People stopped to stare at the foreign youth with the intense eyes and the strange accent. Some turned away, but some recognized something in him, a quality that transcended culture and language. He found teachers in the ashrams. The being continued. Masters of disciplines that had been refined for thousands of years, yoga, meditation, energy work, practices designed to awaken the divine potential dormant in every human body. James observed as Jesus learned to sit for hours without moving, to control his breath in ways that seemed impossible, to direct energy through pathways in his body that Western medicine wouldn't acknowledge for 2,000 years. The healings he later performed were not acts of God reaching down from heaven. They were applications of techniques he learned here. The being showed James images of healers working with their hands held inches from patients' bodies, directing energy, clearing blockages, restoring flow. When Jesus laid hands on the sick, he was using these same techniques, amplified by a consciousness that had been trained to exceptional levels of focus and power. The scene shifted again. Now, James stood in mountains so high the air itself seemed thin. Snow-capped peaks surrounded a monastery built into the living rock, Tibet. The being's voice was reverent, the final stage of his training. Here, in monasteries that had preserved knowledge from before the last great catastrophe, Jesus learned the deepest secrets. James watched an older Jesus, now in his mid-20s, sit with monks in saffron robes. They practiced meditation techniques that seemed to alter the very fabric of space. They studied texts written in languages that predated Sanskrit. They explored states of consciousness that had no names in any Western vocabulary. Here he learned to leave his body, to project his consciousness across vast distances. This is how he knew what people were thinking before they spoke, how he perceived Nathanael under the fig tree before they ever met, how he appeared to his disciples after the crucifixion in a form that could walk through walls. James felt his mind reeling. Every miracle in the Gospels, every supernatural act that he had spent his career trying to explain historically or dismiss theologically. All of it had explanations, not mundane explanations, but explanations rooted in training, in practice, in techniques that had been deliberately hidden from the Western world. Why? James demanded. Why hide all this? Why turn him into a unique divine being instead of a teacher showing what's possible? The scene shifted one final time. James found himself in a dark room. Men in ornate robes sat around a table, arguing. He recognized the setting from his historical studies, a church council, 4th century. This is where your religion was shaped. The being's voice was heavy with sorrow, not by Jesus, not by his earliest followers, by men who had never met him, living 3 centuries after his death, serving an empire that needed a state religion to maintain control. James watched the arguments unfold, debates about Jesus' nature. Was he human? Was he divine? Was he both? Different factions pushed different positions. Political alliances formed and dissolved. Threats were made. Compromises struck. They chose to make him God. The being explained, not because it was true, because it was useful. A human teacher who achieved extraordinary abilities through training can be imitated. A unique Son of God, divine from birth, cannot be. By making Jesus singular, they made him unreachable. His abilities became miracles only he could perform. His achievements became evidence of special status rather than demonstrations of human potential. James watched as texts were sorted, some accepted into the canon, others rejected, burned, forbidden. The Gospels that spoke of his training were destroyed. References to his travels were edited out. The 18 years were made silent, because those years contained the one thing the new religion could never allow, proof that Jesus' abilities came from practice, not from unique divine nature. The scene dissolved. James found himself back in the chamber of records, the being standing before him, those vast dark eyes watching with infinite patience. James sank to the floor. His legs wouldn't support him. Everything he thought he knew, everything he had taught for 35 years, it was all built on a foundation of deliberate lies. The church, he whispered, my entire career. I was teaching a constructed narrative. You were teaching what you were given. The being's voice was compassionate. You cannot blame yourself for accepting the only story you were allowed to know. But why? Why would they hide something so important? Because of what humanity would become if it knew. The being knelt beside him, its luminous form casting soft light across his tear-streaked face. Imagine a world where every human knew that Jesus' abilities were achievable, where the practices he learned were taught in every village, where people devoted themselves to awakening rather than worship. James imagined it, a humanity of awakened beings, healing each other, communicating telepathically, perceiving reality beyond the narrow band that most people accepted. Such a humanity could not be controlled, could not be taxed, could not be sent to war. could not be convinced to labor for the benefit of the few while the many struggled in poverty. The being paused. The missing years were erased because they contained the key to human liberation, and those who benefit from human limitation could not allow that key to be found. James wiped his face with trembling hands. But the key wasn't lost. The knowledge Jesus learned still exists in Egypt, in India, in Tibet. I've read fragments of it. The knowledge exists. The being acknowledged, scattered, obscured, hidden behind cultural barriers and linguistic challenges. But yes, it persists. And in recent decades, it has been slowly returning to the West. Yoga, meditation, energy healing, practices that Jesus mastered 2,000 years ago are now being taught in studios and retreat centers across your world. James felt something shift inside him. The despair that had gripped him was giving way to something else. Understanding, hope. The awakening is already happening, he said slowly. People are already learning what Jesus learned. They just don't know it's connected to him. Yes, the being's eyes pulsed with light. The same techniques, the same principles, rediscovered independently or transmitted through lineages that preserved what the church tried to destroy. Humanity is beginning to remember what it forgot. The only difference now is that the connection can be made explicit. The missing years can be revealed. And people can understand that when they practice meditation, when they learn energy healing, when they develop intuition, they are walking the same path Jesus walked. James stood slowly. His body felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight he hadn't known he was carrying had been lifted. What about the teachings? Not just the techniques, but the actual content. What did Jesus learn about God, about reality, about the purpose of existence? The being seemed to brighten. This is the heart of what was hidden. The techniques were erased because they were dangerous, but the philosophy was erased because it was revolutionary. New images appeared in the air around them. James saw Jesus in conversation with masters from different traditions, heard fragments of discussions that crossed cultural and theological boundaries. He learned that God is not a being separate from creation. God is the consciousness that underlies all existence, the source from which everything emerges and to which everything returns. Not a judge on a throne, but the infinite awareness within which all experience occurs. James recognized this. It was what the mystics had always said, what the church had always condemned as heresy. He learned that humans are not fallen creatures in need of salvation from an external source. They are sparks of divine consciousness, temporarily inhabiting physical form. The purpose of life is not to earn heaven through belief or obedience. It is to awaken to what you already are, to realize the divine nature that was never absent, only forgotten. The kingdom of heaven is within you, James whispered. He said it directly, and no one understood. Some understood. The being corrected, the Gnostics, the mystics, the contemplatives in every tradition who pursued direct experience rather than doctrine. But they were marginalized, persecuted, their writings destroyed. The church needed people to believe that salvation came through the church, that priests were necessary intermediaries, that ordinary humans could not approach God directly. James saw now how the entire structure of institutional Christianity had been designed to prevent exactly what Jesus taught, to create dependency rather than awakening, to promise heaven later rather than presence now. He learned that death is not an ending. The being continued. Consciousness is eternal. It passes through physical forms like water through vessels. What you call death is simply the releasing of one vessel and the continuation of the water. This is why he could say that those who followed his teachings would never taste death. He didn't mean physical immortality. He meant identification with the consciousness that does not die, rather than the body that does. James thought about his own fear of death, the fear that the church had used for centuries to maintain control, the terror of hell, the desperate hope of heaven, all of it manipulation, all of it designed to keep people from discovering what Jesus actually taught. The resurrection, James said. Was it real? The being was silent for a moment. It was real, but not as your church teaches. Jesus had trained his consciousness to a level where it was no longer dependent on his physical body. When the body was destroyed, the consciousness continued. and because he had achieved such mastery, he was able to manifest a form that his disciples could perceive. He appeared to them not as a resuscitated corpse, but as consciousness made temporarily visible. Can others do this? Others have done this throughout history, masters who achieved similar levels of awakening. Your church calls them saints and attributes their abilities to God's special favor. In truth, they were practitioners who walked the same path Jesus walked and achieved similar results. James paced the chamber, his mind racing with implications. If I share this, if I tell people what I've learned here, they'll think I've lost my mind. They already think I'm a heretic. This will confirm it. Some will think that, the being acknowledged. Others will recognize the truth, the same way you recognized it when I appeared to you. There is a resonance when truth is spoken, a vibration that something deep in human consciousness responds to, regardless of conditioning. But how do I prove it? How do I show people that this is real and not just another story? You don't prove it with evidence. Evidence can always be disputed, dismissed, explained away. The being moved closer to James. You prove it with demonstration. You learn what Jesus learned. You practice what he practiced. You develop the abilities he developed, and then you teach others to do the same. James felt a chill run through him. You're saying I should become what he became. I am saying you should become what every human is capable of becoming. What Jesus demonstrated was not unique to him. It was unique only in that he was willing to pursue it fully. The same potential exists in you, in everyone. The only question is whether you are willing to walk the path. James thought about his life, the career that was over, the marriage that had ended, the reputation that was destroyed. He had nothing left to protect, nothing left to lose. Teach me, he said, not just the history, the practices, the techniques. Teach me to do what he did. The being's luminous form seemed to pulse with approval. That is why you were chosen, James Thornton, not because you are special, because you are ready, because you have sacrificed everything for truth, and because you will not hoard what you learn, but share it with others who are ready to receive. The chamber began to change around them. The symbols on the walls rearranged themselves into patterns that seemed to speak directly to something deep in James's consciousness. The training Jesus received took 15 years. The being's voice was gentle but serious. You do not have 15 years, but you have something he did not have, the benefit of his demonstration. The path has been walked. The territory has been mapped. You can progress faster because you are following, rather than pioneering. James straightened his spine. Whatever came next, he was ready. We will begin with breath. The being raised one hand, and James felt the air in the chamber shift, the foundation of everything else. Jesus learned this in Egypt and refined it in India. The breath is the bridge between conscious and unconscious, between body and spirit, between the limited self and the infinite. Master this, and everything else becomes possible. James closed his eyes and began to breathe, and in that chamber of records, surrounded by the true history of Jesus of Nazareth, a disgraced biblical scholar began the education that would transform him into something the church had spent 2,000 years trying to prevent, a human being walking the same path as Christ, not to worship him, to become like him. James spent what felt like weeks in the chamber, though when he finally returned to his body in the mountain clearing, only hours had passed. The being had taught him the foundations, breathing techniques that altered consciousness, meditation practices that stilled the endless chatter of the mind, energy exercises that awakened sensations in his body he had never felt before. You have the seeds now. The being's form had begun to fade with the approaching dawn. Water them. Practice daily. What took Jesus years will take you less time because you understand the destination, but it will still require dedication. Will I see you again? When you need guidance, still your mind and ask. We are always watching, always available to those who learn to listen. And then the being was gone. The clearing was empty. James stood alone in the pre-dawn forest, his breath making clouds in the cold air. He walked back to his house in a daze. Everything looked different, not just metaphorically. He could see energy now, faintly, halos around the trees, patterns in the air, the first hints of the perception that Jesus had mastered 2,000 years ago. James sat down at his desk, His notes from 35 years of research surrounded him, all of it pointing toward what he had just experienced, all of it vindicated. He began to write, not an academic paper, not a careful hedging argument designed to survive peer review. He wrote what he had seen, what he had learned, what the missing years actually contained. The words poured out of him faster than he could type. By noon, he had written 15,000 words. By evening, 30,000. He didn't eat, didn't sleep. The story demanded to be told. 3 days later, he had a manuscript, rough, unpolished, but complete. The true history of Jesus' missing years, the techniques he learned, the philosophy behind them, and the reason it had all been hidden. James looked at the document on his screen. If he published this, his remaining reputation would be destroyed. The few colleagues who still spoke to him would abandon him. He would become not just a heretic, but a laughingstock. He published it anyway. He put it on the website he had maintained for years, the site where he posted his research that no journal would accept. He shared it on social media. He sent it to everyone on his mailing list. Then he waited. The first responses came within hours, mockery, mostly. Former colleagues expressing concern for his mental health, religious commentators denouncing him as a tool of Satan. But beneath the noise, something else emerged. Private messages from people who had felt the truth of what he wrote, who had sensed for years that something was missing from the story of Jesus, who had practiced meditation or yoga and intuited that they were touching something ancient and connected. "Thank you," one message read. "I've been searching for this my whole life without knowing what I was searching for." "I knew it," wrote another. "I always knew the church was hiding something. Now I understand what." The messages multiplied, hundreds, then thousands. James couldn't respond to them all, but he read every one. 1 month after the encounter, James received a message that changed everything. It was from a woman named Maria. She lived in New Mexico and had been practicing what she called Christian meditation for 20 years. But it wasn't the meditation taught in churches. It was something older, something her grandmother had passed down, claiming it came from a lineage that traced back to the earliest followers of Jesus. "Your manuscript describes techniques that my grandmother taught me," Maria wrote. "Breathing practices, energy work, methods of prayer that are nothing like what the church teaches. I thought my family was unique. Now I understand we were preserving what was supposed to be destroyed." James wrote back immediately. They spoke on the phone for 3 hours. Maria's lineage had maintained practices that matched exactly what the being had shown him. Practices that had been passed down in secret for nearly 2,000 years, surviving persecution, inquisition, and suppression. She wasn't alone. As James's manuscript spread, others emerged. Families who had preserved fragments of the original teachings, practitioners who had rediscovered techniques independently through meditation and contemplation, scholars who had found references in obscure texts and recognized the pattern. A network began to form. Not an organization, nothing hierarchical, just a web of connection between people who carried pieces of what had been hidden. 3 months after the encounter, James held his first gathering. It was in his living room in the Blue Ridge Mountains. 12 people came. Maria from New Mexico, a former priest from Boston who had left the church after mystical experiences the institution couldn't explain. A yoga teacher from California who had always sensed that her practice was connected to something older than Hindu tradition. A physicist who had been studying consciousness and suspected that ancient traditions understood things modern science was only beginning to discover. James didn't lecture them. He shared what he had learned. And then they practiced together, the breathing techniques, the meditation methods, the energy exercises. 12 people sitting in a circle in a mountain cabin, doing what Jesus had done in Egyptian temples and Indian ashrams 2,000 years ago. Something happened in that room. James felt it. They all felt it. A field of energy that built as they practiced together. A connection that transcended ordinary social bonds. By the end of the evening, several of them were weeping, not from sadness, from recognition. "This is what church was supposed to be," the former priest said quietly. "Not doctrine and ritual. This, direct experience, shared awakening." The gatherings continued. Word spread. More people came. James found himself traveling, teaching, sharing what he had learned. not as a guru or authority, but as a fellow student. Everyone who came was encouraged to practice, to develop their own abilities, to become teachers themselves. 6 months after the encounter, James received an invitation that surprised him. It was from a bishop, a high-ranking official in one of the major denominations. He had read James's manuscript and wanted to meet privately. James expected confrontation, condemnation, perhaps an attempt to silence him. What he found was a tired old man in a coffee shop in Charlotte, looking at him with eyes full of questions. "I've served the church for 40 years, the bishop said. "I've preached the official story, defended the doctrines, built my life on the foundation I was given." He paused. "But I've always known something was missing, something important, something the institution was hiding." James waited. "I've had experiences," the bishop continued quietly. "During prayer, during meditation I wasn't supposed to be doing. Experiences that don't fit the theology I teach, states of consciousness that the church would call dangerous or demonic." He looked at James with something like desperation. "Your manuscript explains what I've experienced. It explains everything, and I don't know what to do with that." James reached across the table and took the old man's hand. "You do what we all do. You practice, you awaken, and when you're ready, you share what you've learned, not from a position of authority, from a position of shared humanity." The bishop was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "The church will destroy me, everything I've built, everything I've been. Everything you've built has been built on a lie, not your lie, but a lie nonetheless." James squeezed his hand. "What you build next can be built on truth." The bishop didn't leave the church immediately, but he began to change what he taught. Subtle shifts, an emphasis on direct experience rather than belief. Meditation practices introduced as contemplative prayer, references to the mystics who had always known what the institution tried to hide. And he wasn't alone. As James's network grew, they discovered allies in unexpected places, priests and ministers who had always suspected, theologians who had found fragments of the truth in suppressed texts, religious leaders who were ready to guide their communities toward awakening rather than mere worship. 1 year after the encounter in the clearing, James stood before a gathering of 300 people in a conference center in Colorado. They had come from across the country, from different traditions, different backgrounds, united by a shared recognition that something profound was emerging. 2,000 years ago, James told them, a man walked a path of awakening. He learned techniques that allowed him to access states of consciousness most people don't believe exist. He developed abilities that seemed miraculous but were actually the result of training and practice, and he tried to show others that they could do the same. The room was silent, 300 people barely breathing. The institution that claimed his name spent 2,000 years hiding what he actually taught. They erased his training. They made him unique, unreachable, divine, in a way that ordinary humans could never approach. They turned a demonstration of human potential into a story of special divine favor. James paused, looked around the room at faces he had come to know, seekers and teachers, questioners and practitioners, the beginnings of something new. But the truth couldn't be destroyed. It was preserved in secret lineages, hidden in mystery traditions, encoded in mystical texts, and now it's emerging again, not through one teacher, through all of us, everyone who practices, everyone who awakens, everyone who discovers that the abilities Jesus demonstrated are not reserved for a unique son of God, but available to every son and daughter of humanity. The energy in the room shifted. James could see it now as clearly as he saw the physical forms of the people before him, light building, connections forming, the field of awakened consciousness growing stronger. The missing years aren't missing anymore. The techniques aren't secret anymore. The path that Jesus walked is open to anyone willing to walk it. He looked at the gathering, at the movement that was forming despite all efforts to prevent it. We're not here to worship him. We're here to become like him. And in doing so, to complete the mission he started 2,000 years ago. The room erupted in applause, but James barely heard it. He was thinking about the being in the clearing, about the records that had been kept, about the truth that had been hidden for so long. The church had buried the missing years because they contained the key to human liberation, now that key was found, and the doors were beginning to open. James Thornton spent 35 years asking a question that destroyed his career. Where did Jesus go during the 18 years the Bible refuses to discuss? What did he learn? Who taught him? One encounter in a mountain clearing gave him the answer. Jesus wasn't born with miraculous abilities. He developed them. Through training, through practice, through years of study with masters in Egypt, India, and Tibet, who taught him techniques that the church has spent 2,000 years trying to erase. The missing years weren't lost by accident. They were hidden deliberately. Because if people knew that Jesus' abilities came from training rather than unique divine nature, they would try to learn what he learned. They would walk the path he walked. They would become what he became, and a humanity of awakened beings cannot be controlled. The water into wine, the healing of the sick, the raising of the dead, the resurrection itself. None of it was magic reserved for a singular Son of God. All of it was the application of techniques that any human can learn, that masters in various traditions have learned throughout history, that people are learning right now in meditation centers and yoga studios across the world, often without realizing they're walking the same path Jesus walked. The church made him unreachable, so you would worship instead of practice. They made him divine, so you would feel unworthy to follow. They erased the missing years because those years contained the one truth they could never allow you to know. You can do what he did, not through special favor, not through belief, through training, through practice, through the same dedication he showed when he left Nazareth as a teenager and didn't return until he was ready to demonstrate what a fully awakened human could become. If this story stirred something in you, if you felt the recognition of truth that goes deeper than belief, leave a comment. Share what you felt. Share what you've always suspected about the gap in the Gospels that no one was supposed to question. And if you want more revelations about what has been hidden from humanity, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. The missing years have been found, the techniques have survived, the path is open, and the only question now is whether you're ready to walk it.